Dear all, I want to start by thanking especially Mr. George Rokas for inviting me, and also Doğan Bermek for introducing me to this distinguished community. What I will do now is to talk about the ways in which different groups of faith have been accommodated in Turkey in the last 90 years, but specifically focus on the recent reign of the Justice and Development Party, AKP. So there is a slight change in my title, and the title will be Laicism, Secularism, Religion, and the Myth of Tolerance in Turkey. And I will use some of these extracts of my recent book titled Europeanization and Tolerance in Turkey, The Myth of Toleration, which just recently came out from Palgrave, London. Although Turkey is a secular state, the constitution of which guarantees the freedom of conscience and religion, it doesn't really have a comprehensive and consistent policy on the freedom of faith. The way in which the principle of laicism is commonly addressed and implemented in Turkey seems to be considerably far from being a democratic principle that can be used as a framework in matters related to religious freedom and in governing state-society relations. The Turkish state has always been negatively biased against the non-Sunni Muslims and non-Muslim groups. The laicist state was, rhetorically speaking, in an equal distance to all faith groups. But it is commonly known that the modern Turkish state was in fact a Sunni state. And since the AKP elite has come to power, the state has been transformed into a machinery which has revitalized the multiculturalist Ottoman millet system and essentialized the rhetoric of tolerance vis-à-vis non-Sunni and non-Muslim populations who are perceived to be subject to the benevolence of the state actors. In the meantime, Turkey has recently witnessed a growing revanchist attitude coming from the AKP elite vis-à-vis the former Kemalist, laicist, secular segments of the society. In this paper, I will talk about the ways in which the notions of laicism, secularism, and tolerance have been deployed by the state actors to control the masses in Turkey. And I will argue that the ideology of laicism was manipulated by the Kemalist elite to rule the masses through generating a form of political Islam, while the Justice and Development Party accused the Kemalist elite of being anti-religious to win the hearts of the Sunni majority at the expense of the others. So in this sense, there is a continuity in the modern Turkish state, which is still there. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor distinguishes between three different meanings of secularism. The first one is Republican secularism as the complete separation of state and church, of politics and religion, of the profane and the divine, as in the French laicist model. The second of which is the atheist secularism, as a general disbelief in God and religion, that is atheism, as in the former communist regimes. And finally, the third one is liberal secularism, as religious liberty and plurality in the public sphere. And this is this third conception of secularism as experienced in the United States that Taylor appreciates the most, because secularism in this view means that religious beliefs and communities are fully visible in the public space as alternative ways of life that coexist side by side and with remarkable mobility and interaction. This third model also harmonizes well with the politics of recognition, which is his starting point in discussing tolerance and multiculturalism. The principle of laicism and the Kemalist legacy suggest a preference for the first type of secularism in Turkey. However, it appears to be a false version that conflates the state and mainstream religion with state neutrality and laicism. This false laicism goes a long way in explaining the success of the AKP, a political party which is believed to be a less repressive champion of secularism, and above all, a champion of religious freedom, as in the third type of secularism. But is this really so? Could one call the AKP a political party practicing the secularism of the type 3, as expressed by Charles Taylor? Or is it a non-liberal version of secularism that the AKP endorses? I argue in this paper that the pluralism of the millet system offers a source of misguided inspiration to the AKP in favoring Sunni Islam at the expense of non-Sunni and non-Muslim groups residing in Turkey. After the establishment of the Turkish Republic, education became a very important instrument in modernizing Turkish society in line with the Western model, while emphasizing the role of unity and solidarity in the nation-building process. The early Republican period was a time of rapid political reformation and social transformation. In the early 1920s, the reformation of the educational system was one of the primary concerns of the Turkish state. The reforms in this period focused on establishing a state-controlled form of education instead of one run by the ulema, clergy, and unifying education to minimize the perceived damages of foreign and Christian minority schools through the establishment of a unified curriculum, raising the level of literacy and fostering secularist and nationalist values. To that effect, the Reformation process aimed to produce a Turkish identity that eclipsed Muslim identity via the establishment of a laicist state structure. Following the French model of laïcité, the choice of the early republicanists to insert the principle of laicism into the Turkish constitution in 1937 indicates that the Kemalist elite was not preoccupied at all with the elimination of religion from the public space. On the contrary, they affirmed the fact that Turkish society was religious in a sense. The main rationale behind the insertion of the principle of laicism into the constitution was not to wage a war against Islam, but to provide the people with the power to challenge the rising authority of the Islamic clergy, ulema, since the late 18th century. Laicism, as we all know, derives from the French word laïc or laïc in contemporary usage, lay people in English, meaning of the people as distinguished from the clergy. Hence, laicism actually underscores the distinction between lay members of a church and its clergy. In this sense, rather than antagonizing Islam, laicist rhetoric actually simply means to empower the individual believers vis-à-vis the clergy, at least in rhetoric. However, the laicist ideology has made it possible for the Kemalist elite to politically and culturally instrumentalize Islam to unify the nation through the institutions of the Ministry of Education and the Directorate of Religious Affairs, Diyanet. Hence, misinterpreting the principle of laicism, the Kemalist state created its own version of a political Islam in order to rule the masses. In this sense, it is not correct to accuse the Kemalist state of being hostile to Islam, as has often been claimed by the pro-Islamist political parties and groups in Turkey, ranging from the Welfare Party in the 1990s to the Justice and Development Party nowadays. The Kemalist state was, on the contrary, a Sunni-based state ever since it was established, I argue. The perception that laicism was a kind of anti-religious secularism actually ignores the regime's religious policy and fails to consider the existence of different versions of Islam in Turkey. One of them in power until very recently, that is to say, run by the Kemalists, and others outside of it, that is to say, let's say, the Milli Görüş and radicals such as Hizbullah. So I believe that there are three different versions of political Islam existing in Turkey. I believe that the popular use of the term laïcité has so far made it possible for the citizens of Turkey to freely discuss the differences between the terms laïcism and secularism. These two are often interchangeably being used in Turkey, but they actually have rather different etymologies, institutional histories, and normative theoretical implications. Secularism derives from the Latin word saeculum, meaning generation or age, and originally meant of the world, dünyevi in Turkish, as opposed to of the church, ruhani in Turkish. Hence the term secular differentiates between matters of religiosity and matters of the world. In this sense, secularization of a society simply refers to the diminution of the social significance of religion and growing tendency to do without religion. A secular state then refers to a religion-free state, a kind of state that doesn't apparently comply with the modern Turkish state. In this regard, one could argue that the way laïcism has so far been implemented in Turkey was actually an obstacle to secularization, as it has allowed the state to instrumentalize religion as a tool to control the masses. I assume that the divide between the laicists and Islamists has so far been ideologically manipulated by both the so-called laicist and Islamist political parties. The everlasting political obsession with religion, as displayed by both laicists and Islamists, tends to distract the masses from social and economic problems by engaging them into a rhetorical debate about existential and societal fears. One can clearly see that the theological and political debates around laïcism and Islamism cannot be isolated from the social economic realities in which they are situated. The rise of an Islamic bourgeoisie, the re-Islamization of society and politics in everyday life through the debates on the headscarf issue, Alevism, building up gigantic mosques in various parts of the country, the emergence of consumerist lifestyles, not only among the secular segments of the Turkish society, but also among the practicing Muslims, and finally, the weakening of the legitimacy of the Turkish military as the guardian of national unity and the laicist order are all very important aspects of the ways in which the Turkish society and politics have changed in the last decade. In the Turkish debates on laïcism, there is little acknowledgement of the similarities, let's say, between Alevi organizations and pious Sunni Muslim groups in regard to their position to the laicist regime, nor of their demands for recognition of their practices. I believe that this clearly has to do with the ways in which the regime of laïcism juxtaposes the notions of modernity and reactionary religion as opposite poles in a binary opposition, leaving little room for more complex and creative imaginings. A scientific elaboration of the problems in democratic platforms leads, let's say, both Alevis and headscarf women, for instance, to agree that their problems actually spring from the fact that there is no freedom of religion in Turkey. Hence, one should not underestimate the power of liminal spaces whereby, let's say, Alevis and headscarf women, or Alevis and Sunnis, or Muslims and Christians come together, as they have the potential to be the fertile grounds of dialogue, respect, empathy, recognition, and pluralism. The divided nature of contemporary Turkish society along ethnocultural and religious lines probably originates from the multiculturalist form of governmentality during the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman multiculturalism, or millet system, was usually coupled with the term tolerance, hoşgörü. The concept of tolerance has also a very popular usage in everyday life of Turkey. Turks are usually proud of referring to the millet system of the Ottoman Empire, often known to be the guarantor of tolerance, respecting the boundaries between religious communities. The equivalents of the term tolerance in the Turkish language are, for example, hoşgörü, tahammül, müsamaha, görmezden gelme, and göz yumma. The most popular ones actually refer to the fact that you tolerate the one you see as a burden, which is also exactly the same case in the 16th century Europe. The term tolerance comes from the Latin word tolerar, which is the equivalent of the word burden. So I believe that there is essentially something problematic with the word tolerance. Toleration in the context of the Ottoman Empire, as well as in the modern Turkish context, refers to the absence of persecution of people, but not to their acceptance into society as full, equal, and welcomed members of community, as George indicated very rightly in his opening speech. In this sense, toleration is actually nothing but a form of governmentality, using a term by Michel Foucault, designed to maintain peace and order in multi-ethnic and multi-denominational contexts. The Ottoman imperial experience and the Turkish national experience proved that the Turkish nation tolerate those non-Muslims, non-Sunni Muslims, and non-Turks as long as they did not disturb or go against the Sunni Muslim Turkish order, which I call the Holy Trinity of modern Turkey. For instance, not only the non-Muslims, but also Alevi and Kurdish cases reveal that when ethnocultural and religious minorities did transgress, their recognition could turn into suppression and persecution. Against this background, I argue that the regime of tolerance is far from the problems of contemporary Turkey. What is actually happening now in Turkey and elsewhere, this is also, the rhetoric of tolerance is also very visible in the European context in the last 2 or 3 decades, actually. What is happening in Turkey in this regard and elsewhere is the rise of the discourse of tolerance in a way that leads to the culturalization and depoliticization of what is social and political in the age of neoliberalism, which is primarily shaped by the reduction of materialist civilizational discourse into post-materialist, culturalist forms of civilizational discourse. Hence, the policymakers should not only be limited to the use of the notion of tolerance in settling societal, political, economic, cultural, and religious conflicts. They should also give credit to the notions of respect, recognition, pluralism, and equality in order to create a cohesive society by means of underlining the social and political nature of problems faced in everyday life. As a way of conclusion, I believe that one of the most essential problems of contemporary Turkey is that the state has always monopolized the right to define and shape the principal components of public space. The campaigns of Citizens Speak Turkish in the 1930s and 1940s, the headscarf ban of the last decades, and the AKP's insistence on the discourse underlining that, for instance, Cemevis, Alevi communion houses, are not places of worship in the 2000s. All these are examples of statist understanding of the public space, which have recently been repeated during the AKP rule through the building of shopping malls, skyscrapers, bridges, airports, and gigantic projects without consulting the inhabitants of big cities such as Istanbul and Ankara. In this sense, the Occupy Gezi movement is a revolt of the citizens. It is an utopia created by the citizens. It is an attempt to reassemble the social, which was already divided and compartmentalized. If you're into the Occupy Gezi movement, you will always hear stories like anti-capitalist Muslims, practicing Muslims, praying on Friday in the center of the city, Taksim Square, protected and guarded by the atheists against the police brutality. So I believe that there is a lot of lessons to really learn from the Occupy Gezi movement. If such an understanding becomes widespread among different segments of the Turkish society, which hardly interact and communicate with each other, such as the Alevis and headscarf women, as I told earlier, I believe then a more cohesive society could be established. Actually, in that sense, what happened in Gezi movement last June was also partly due to the ruling elite's negative bias against the non-Sunni way of life. The Gezi movement, in that sense, is a new global social movement which displays similar characteristics compared to its predecessors, such as Tahrir Square, Occupy Wall Street, and European Indignado movements. All these movements, the main common denominator of all these movements is the solidarity. And solidarity coming from their own particular context. And there is also the religious habitus embedded in this discourse of solidarity. Whatever we call it, the Occupy Gezi movement provides us with a prefigurative form of politics, as it was meant to be the rejection of vanguardism, let's say, of Prime Minister Erdogan, in all walks of life, engineering the life worlds of Turkish citizens with regard to his intention of raising a religious and conservative youth, his call upon the mothers to bear at least 3 children, his direct intervention in the content of Turkish soap operas, his direct order to ban alcohol on university campuses, his intention to build mosques in Taksim Square and Çamlıca Hill, his condescending manner of judging the lives of individuals, and his increasing authoritarian discourse based on Islamic references. And what we have heard today is also a continuation of this kind of discourse among the AKP elite with regard to the closure of the Hagia Sophia, not only in Istanbul but also in Trabzon. But I was in Trabzon in May, talking to the locals of that community, and the locals themselves are very much actually annoyed with the growth of such discourses, turning Hagia Sophia in Trabzon into a mosque. So I still believe that the internal dynamic domestic forces of the Turkish civil society, which is becoming more and more Europeanized and more vocal in this sense, is not going to be idle. So there is still a lot to do in Turkey. And finally, with your permission, I would like to reiterate that Turkey needs a radical change in the state-society paradigm. That is to say that the state should adopt an equal distance to all faiths. The state should give up the discourse of tolerance and instead generate an alternative discourse of respect, equality, and recognition vis-à-vis all kinds of faith groups as well as atheists. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.